Hi, and welcome to Bright Church of Christ this morning, and big thanks to Adam for leading us in worship today, and some great songs there. So just want to stay connected with the Lord, connected with the Holy Spirit, connected with each other, and just receive what it is that He has for us as a church today. So we're going to be in John chapter 21 fairly soon, but let's just invite God to speak to us as we're in our different houses, just to open our hearts to Him and allow Him to do what He wants to do in our lives this morning. So it looks like soon we could be coming out of hibernation, so to speak, and there's going to be obviously a lot of changes in the way everything happens around the place for the next few months or however long it goes. But we'll be meeting again. We'll be meeting again in a new environment, in a new context, going from gathering to through this isolation period and into COVID-safe gathering. So we don't know completely what that will be like, but there's a leaving behind of some of the things that were pretty normal in the past, and going forward into just a new a new look of how we do church. So we're sort of working on that, but there'll be obviously some regulations about numbers and spacing and hygiene and all this kind of thing. But even as we go through these changes from the usual way of doing church to doing church like we're doing it now, mainly remotely, and then doing church again in a different way soon, the mission stays the same. The core values stay the same, although the actual way that we do stuff changes. And so we have this sort of picture of doing mission, maintaining our values, maintaining our purpose, but changing the context, so to speak. And this is a bit of a metaphor for what's actually in a bigger sense going on in our church, because we're in this whole time of transition from one season of ministry into another, and sort of moving through this whole process. So we've got this sort of physical metaphor of what's going on spiritually, from a previous season of ministry through transition into a new season of ministry. It's a bigger transition than just going from the old normal to COVID safe. We're also going from church in a previous season to looking to God for refreshment and for new vision and for new purpose and for new direction. And it's been a conscious decision of our church to go through this process and to take this time to reassess a whole lot of moving parts that come together to make the church what it is. So this decision is made because on the premise that the future can't be like the past, won't be like the past. It has to be different in some way. And it's a time just to stand back and reflect and let Jesus come and stand in the midst of His people and speak the fresh thing, speak the re-energizing thing, speak the transforming thing, and bring new life into what we're doing. So, part of this is to celebrate all the positives that have led the church to this point. And, in the transition team, we've been sort of going over a lot of the history of Bright Church of Christ, and there's been some amazing things that have happened, and God's been in the midst of what's gone on over several decades of great ministry. So there's a real place for celebrating the positives. There's a real place for deciding, what are the non-negotiable essentials of our mission that have to be there in every season. And, there's certain things about Christian ministry, there's certain things about, our particular church that are like, this is who we are, this is non-negotiable. But there's also other things that you might say, well, these were good, but they're not essential, because, the mission can still go on without them. We can do the same mission and it can look differently. We can do, and even in our little metaphor of shifting from pre-COVID to COVID. Like, we can do the same stuff, but it looks a bit different. Things that worked really well back then might not work in a new season, even though they were good in the old season. And we can also, look at the church and say, well, there's some things that are better left in the past, because it's better to move on to a new season without them. So this time of transition, is a time for a whole lot of things to happen, for processing what's gone on in the past, for maybe grieving over certain things that were upsetting or difficult, giving thanks for the good things that God has done, celebrating the victories, reconnecting with the core identity of the church, refocusing on mission, and receiving fresh vision from Jesus for what he wants to do in a new season. So, as everyone who's involved in our church knows, we've been sort of entered into this transition season about 4 months ago. And so now we're sort of moving on into a time of, practical exercises with the whole congregation, and, talking about processing our history, and looking to actually step into some of these things and see what God will do in our hearts and in our lives as individuals and as a group. So, that we're coming into this time, participation's important. It's really the key that everyone gets involved. So just encourage you over the next few weeks. You'll hear about it. You'll probably get emails about it, and just invite you to engage in this process, because this can be a really exciting time for God to speak freshly and in a transforming way into your life and into the life of Bright Church of Christ, and of all that he wants to do in the future. And so just going into John chapter 21, and sometimes when we sort of enter into somebody's story in the scriptures, we can start to sense, how God can speak and move in our own life, because, God has done some amazing things in the lives of people in scripture, and, very often he replicates that in some way, or works in our own lives in some way that sort of can follow the pattern of that. So I just wanted to get into a little bit of Peter's story today, and see how understanding his story can help us to engage in this process of transition, in this process of working through history, engaging with history, and allowing it to unfold into fresh hope and fresh vision and fresh direction, because this is what we're being invited to do in this time. So John chapter 21 and verse 1, it says, after these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and in this way he showed himself. So after these things, Jesus showed himself, or made himself visible. And Jesus is intimately engaged with our lives and with our mission. And he chooses certain times for self-revelation. He chooses certain times where, he steps into our story and makes his presence really clear, makes his purpose really clear, and even unfolds things that we haven't understood about him before, that sort of changes the settings of what we're doing and of who we are, and prepares us for the next season of life. And, sometimes, it's good to be expecting Jesus, to step into situations, because this is what he does. And in this case, in Peter's life, he is about to release something. He's about to release reaffirmation of Peter's calling. He's about to release reorientation of how that calling is going to unfold. He's about to place fresh hope into his life. And these are things that Jesus does. When Jesus steps into your world, he's going to bring fresh hope. He's going to bring reaffirmation and reorientation and fresh excitement and fresh passion and about what his plans are for you, about what his purposes are for you, and what your place is in the things that he is doing. So after these things, of course, Jesus has been resurrected, and he has already appeared twice to the disciples. He's just appeared in the room where they're meeting. We know the story about Thomas, and he wasn't there the first time. He was there the second time, and Jesus really ministered to him in that whole area where he was, had some questions and some doubts. So now we have this scene by the lake of Tiberias, or the Sea of Galilee, and there's 7 of the disciples, 7 of the 12 in this boat, and it's Simon Peter, who is the volatile one, I guess. There's Thomas, who'd been through all his doubts, Nathaniel, who is the one Jesus said, in whom there is no guile, an Israelite in whom there is no guile, and the sons of Zebedee, the sons of thunder, James and John, and a couple of others that are unnamed in this passage. So this group's been together for a long time. They've been with Jesus for over 3 years, and they have seen these most extraordinary, life-shaping things that have taken place. They've seen Jesus raise the dead, walk on water, feed the 5,000. They've received revelation of who Jesus is. Jesus said, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter is coming out, "Lord, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God." They've known who Jesus is, and then they've walked through that Passion Week, the trial, the crucifixion, then the resurrection, and he's appeared among them. So it's been like a head-spinning season for these guys, and lots of things have happened, and they've become bonded. When you walk through with a group of people through all these kinds of life-changing events, there's a bond that takes place, and so they've been bonded together. They've experienced incredible times of wonder. The transfiguration. Peter was there on the mountain when Jesus was transfigured. He's seen dead people come alive. He's seen God's kingdom manifest, God's reign manifest in the midst of these ministry settings and the different things that have happened. He's understood the identity of Jesus. He's been amazed and shocked and had his whole thinking changed. Jesus has said, "I'm going to be crucified," and Peter has challenged him. He said, "No, no, no." And Jesus said to him, "Get behind me, Satan. You're making me stumble." And Jesus has said to Peter, "You'll deny me." Peter said, "I will never do that. I would never do that." And we find that in Luke chapter 22. Jesus says to Peter, verse 31, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked for you that he may sift you as wheat." This idea of the wheat being thrown in the air and the chaff being blown away, and this whole kind of idea of sifting sounds pretty scary. That your life is going to be sifted to see what's in there. And Jesus says, "But I've prayed for you that your faith should not fail. And when you've returned to me," he said, "strengthen your brothers." And he reacts to this, Peter. He goes, "Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death." And Jesus says to him, "I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows 3 times, you'll deny that you know me. Before the rooster crows, you'll deny 3 times that you know me." And in Matthew's account, again, Jesus talks about this, and he says in Matthew 26:30, when he'd sung a hymn and went out to the Mount of Olives, Jesus said to them, "All of you will be made to stumble because of me this night. For it's written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I've been raised, I will go before you to Galilee." And Peter answers and says to him, even if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble, Jesus. I'm committed. And he makes this statement. I would never do that. You'll never catch me doing that. And how many times, have we as believers said, well, others may fall in that way, but I never will. Others might get caught up in this, but I never will, because we have this sometimes delusion maybe about what our capacity actually is and how dependent we really are on the grace of God and having him strengthen us in every season. Jesus says to him again, assuredly I say to you this night before the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times. And Peter says to him, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. So Peter's really convinced about his personal capacity and how things are going to turn out. Even if there's this onslaught of opposition, he's going to be fine. He's going to stick with Jesus and walk through that issue. So he has this sort of human bravado about him, and we know that he's been like that at different times, a bit impetuous kind of a character that we see portrayed in the Gospels. So Peter has been there at Gethsemane when Jesus is praying and sweating blood as he's resisting our sin and realizing the personal cost of what he's about to go through. And as Jesus is arrested, Peter has tried to defend him with a sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servants, and Jesus has reached out and healed the guy that's trying to arrest him. And you see this whole polarization, of human self-protection and this yielding of Jesus to the will of God, even though it's painful. So he's been there, but in the midst of this crisis, he has very publicly failed his own integrity test. And he said to Jesus, even if all are made to stumble, I will never be made to stumble. Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And then, within hours, like, this whole thing is reversed. And they've arrested Jesus. They've brought him to the high priest's house in Luke 22:54. He's in the courtyard. They've sat down together, and Peter's among them. And this servant girl sees Peter and sitting by the fire, and she looks at him. And there's this recognition. And he says, and she points at Peter and says, oh, this man, he was also with Jesus. He's one of them. And Peter, in that moment, he goes, woman, I don't know him. And then after a little while, another saw him and said, you're also one of them, Peter. And Peter says, man, I'm not. No. Then after about an hour had passed, another confidently affirmed, saying, surely this fellow also was with him, for he's a Galilean. And Peter says, man, I do not know what you're saying. And Luke tells us immediately, while he's still speaking, the rooster crows that Jesus has predicted. And Jesus, who's some distance away, having been arrested, he just turns and looks at Peter. And Peter remembers the words that Jesus had said to him, before the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times. And Luke tells us, like, he went out and he wept bitterly. This sense of failure and self-disappointment just comes upon him in that moment, when suddenly he realizes, like, Jesus warned me, Jesus predicted this, and I still fell for it, and I failed my integrity test in this moment. So now, back in John chapter 21, he's with the bunch of disciples. They're there together. And he says to them, I'm going fishing. And they say to him, well, we'll go with you as well. And immediately the 7 of them get out in the boat and off they go. And it says that night they caught nothing. You know, fishing is Peter's natural comfort zone. You know, often in a crisis, you'll go back to the familiar. You know, you'll do your hobby, or you'll go to your favorite place, or you'll watch your favorite TV show, or you'll listen to your favorite music, or you'll read your favorite books or whatever. But you find a way, a familiar place where you can process, where you can reflect, where you can deal with all of this stuff and try to make sense of everything that's gone on in your life. So Peter's in this sort of state and of needing to recenter, needing to process, needing to reflect, and needing to recapture this sense of direction. And it's in this time, you know, steps into his world again. And this is the environment where John tells us that Jesus made himself visible once again to his disciples. He presented himself. And it says in verse 4, as morning came, Jesus stood on the shore. Yet the disciples didn't know that it was Jesus. So they're out there fishing. They've been through all this turmoil. They've seen the crucifixion and the resurrection. Jesus has appeared to them. They're still trying to work out what all of this means. They're in a season of working out what everything means, all of this amazing stuff that's happened over 3 years. And they're in this boat, they've gone fishing and they've caught nothing, and Jesus is standing on the shore. They don't recognize him, and then he speaks. And he says to them, children, have you any food? And they answered, no. No. Peter's pain has even spilt out into his comfort zone. Like, this is his profession. This is where things go right. He knows how to fish. He might not know how to, survive opposition in the high priest's courtyard, where he's pointed out as being one of Jesus' friends. And in that pressure situation, he falls apart and denies that he knows him. But here on the Sea of Galilee, this is home base. This is where, things, pretty much he's got it sorted. Yet he's been out there all night and caught nothing. These guys are fishermen. And the word Jesus used here, children, or some translations may say friend, but it's a word that refers to an infant or a little child. It's also a word that Jesus uses about the mindset of a disciple. Unless you become like a little child, you won't enter the reign of God or the kingdom of heaven. And it's the word you would use for a deeply treasured bond as of a parent to a child. So it's a word about a treasured relationship. And there's gentleness here from Jesus. And, Isaiah said in Isaiah 42 verse 3, a bruised reed he will not break. So here comes Jesus into the disciples' world on this night where the fishing hasn't worked out, and he speaks with gentleness. Children, have you any food, or have you any fish? Have you caught anything? And then they say no, and then Jesus says this to them. He says, cast the nets on the right side of the boat and you'll find some. Cast the net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some. But we've been fishing all night, Jesus. We've been out here for hours, they could say, and could come to shore. But they cast the net and they're unable to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. Right now in Peter's head, is this rewind is going to start, this replay. This is the same thing that happened three 3 or so years before. This is exactly what happened when Peter called Jesus into service. And in Luke chapter 5, we have this very, very similar scene on exactly the same sea, the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus is speaking, and he goes out on the boats of Peter and Andrew and James and John. They're there, and they're fishermen. And Peter gets into one of the boats, Peter's boat, and asks him to put out a little bit from the land. And he sits down and teaches the multitude from the boat, like it's the platform. And of course, sound would travel across the water. It'd be a great little way to address a crowd. And it says, when he stopped speaking in verse 4 of Luke 5, he says to them, "Launch out in the deep and let down your nets for a catch." But Simon answers and said to him, "Master, we've toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the nets." And when they had done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. So here we have a guy who's not a fisherman telling the fishermen, "Hey, try one more time." And they put out the net, and now the net is breaking with the catch. They signal to their partners in the other boats, James and John, and they come to them, and they fill both the boats to the point they're about to sink. And Luke says, when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man." Depart from me, I'm a sinful man. This is overwhelming. I can't stand in this holy ground that you are bringing into this situation. For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish which they had taken, and so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were their partners. And Jesus said to him, he says, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will catch men." So when they had brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed. This was like the event that crystallized Peter and his brother and James and John, their commitment to follow Jesus. They knew he was around, but in this moment, like, bang. You know, they understood something that they hadn't understood before. Things started to click, and when that catch of fish came in, they responded to the call of Jesus to follow him. And he said, "I will make you to become fishers of men." So now, in this moment, we see like Jesus using this code, to reaffirm the calling of Peter. Because now, these 3 or so years later, they're on the same lake. A very, very similar thing happens when Jesus says, "Let down your nets again," on the right side of the boat. And suddenly there's this massive catch of fish. And verse 7 of John 21, "Therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, 'It's the Lord.'" They suddenly realize it's Jesus standing on the shore. This guy who said, "Children, have you got any food?" Now they realize, hey, this is Jesus. We just did what he said again. And, the net has been filled with fish again. And when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he'd removed it, and plunged into the sea. But the other disciples came in their little boats, for they were not far from land, dragging the net with fish. Then as soon as they came to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on it, and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you've just caught." So Jesus already has the fire ready. And Simon went up and dragged the net to the land full of large fish, 153 fish. And although there were so many, the net was not broken. Jesus said to them, "Come and eat breakfast." Yet none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. This was Jesus. This was Jesus who had been tortured and brutalized and crucified and dead. This was the Jesus who'd risen from the dead and presented himself repeatedly to people who knew him. And now he's standing there on the seashore. Now he's cooking them breakfast on a fire that he has provided on the beach. Jesus then came and took the bread and gave it to them along with the fish. This, says John, is the third time Jesus showed himself to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. Jesus knew what he was doing with Peter all along, and he knew what he was doing with each of us. All of our weaknesses are known to God when he calls us. And when Peter was called on that first time with the first catch of fish, Jesus knew all of his weaknesses, that there was potential for him to stumble in the way he did, that there was potential for the mess that happened in his life on that night. There was potential for him to be volatile and, to speak with his foot in the mouth, or whatever people say about Peter. He knew all about it, but he called him. And now, following on from all of this upheaval, Jesus, stands on the shore of the same sea and reaffirms the call. And Romans 11:29, Paul writes this. He says, the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. When he calls, he calls. And it's up to us to step in and to participate in the call that he makes. And there was even that little personal touch. You see, Jesus understood when Jesus looked at Peter in the courtyard after the rooster crowed. Jesus could read the disappointment and the grief. And when he rose from the dead in Mark 16, and he's speaking to the women that came to the tomb, he says to them, the man at the tomb, the heavenly visitor at the tomb, says to them, don't be alarmed. You see Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He's risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him. And then he says this, go tell his disciples and Peter, that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him. Well, Peter is one of the disciples, but there's this emphasis coming from God's heart. Hey, tell Peter he's risen. Peter's the one who denied him. Peter's the one who's feeling this crushing disappointment. And God is saying, hey, make sure Peter hears. Make sure Peter knows about this. So when they'd eaten breakfast, Jesus prepared the bread and the fish on the seashore. Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, wonder how Peter felt in that little moment. Simon, now it's down to business. Now I'm going to get corrected. Now I'm going to have to face up to what happened back in the courtyard. Now he wants to talk to me personally. What's this going to be like? How did Peter feel in that moment? Well, this is the moment that Jesus is going to redeem Peter's history. This is the moment that he is going to set his mind on the future instead of the past. This is the moment he's going to process a whole lot of stuff. See, Peter's journey to date had included the most stunning revelation about Jesus and about who God is. It had included this personal calling. It had included a vision to fish for people, to be a collector of human beings, to draw people into God's kingdom. But it had also included blunders and mistakes, failures and disappointments. So out of Peter's history, there's non-negotiables that have to be carried forward into the future. There are other things that are best left in the past. And there are things that worked in that first season that aren't just appropriate or needed anymore. So, situation, and Jesus turns to him and says, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than all your buddies here? And he says to him, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And he says to him, feed my lambs. Keep doing my work. And he says to him a second time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And he says to him, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And he says to him, tend my sheep. Feed my sheep. Tend my sheep. And he says to him the third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And John says Peter was grieved because he said this to him the third time, do you love me? And you know I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Most assuredly I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. You did your own thing. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hands and another, someone else, will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And tradition is that Peter was crucified upside down in Rome. And when he had spoken this, he said to Peter, follow me. This is the same thing that he'd said on the shore of the same sea 3 years ago. Follow me, and I'll make you to become fishers of men. So Jesus reaffirms the call of God on Peter in a language and a code and a situation that Peter can fully understand. He's just stepped into this space of reassessment and focused him on his mission. So Peter's 3 denials are negated by these 3 affirmations of his love. I don't know him. I've never been with him. I don't know what you're talking about. Now he said, Lord, you know I love you. You know I love you. You know everything. You know I love you. And it's like, here is this opportunity to just get this trauma of the past out of his heart, to get it healed, to get released, to get free, so it's not dragging him down and stopping him from progressing forward. So in a way, it's really, Jesus has reaffirmed the call, and it's really for Peter to say, like, I want to step back into this. I want to make it clear I'm still on board with the vision. So, the pain and confusion of Peter's trauma is really allowed to be dealt with a lot in this scene in his life. The bitter weeping as he walked out of the high priest's court. Maybe they're continuing on with a bit of deadness inside. Some of the excitement and passion that he had is kind of, because there's regret, there's self-doubt, there's grief. Rushing to the tomb after he heard from the women that Jesus was alive, looking inside, feeling like, I could have done better than this on that night. Now the blunders will be left behind and the positives will be carried forward. All the revelation of Jesus, of the Father, of the kingdom, of all the incredible ways that he can do ministry and reach people. The teaching, the wisdom, the revelation of love that's never been seen before on this planet. This understanding of walking in communion with God and living in his presence. So these positives will be carried forward into the rest of Peter's journey. The mission is unchanged. From now on, he said the first time, you'll catch men. Follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. Second time, feed my lambs, follow me. The same calling is on Peter that he had before. But the mission now is going to get clarified. In the next few weeks, a lot of details are going to come into place. Before long, he is going to be baptized in the Holy Spirit. He's going to receive empowerment. So there's going to be more grace, not less. Jesus hadn't come there to tell him off and say, hey, you're going to have to step down to a lower rank. You're sort of on the outer now because you denied me. There's going to be more grace, more empowerment, more encouragement, more revelation, more joy, not less, along, of course, with more opposition, which is part of the deal. Within weeks, he'll be baptized in the Holy Spirit and become the prominent person, the leader in the Jerusalem church for quite some time. So here in Peter's story, like, we have a metaphor for what is going on in this season. From a previous season of ministry through a transition to a new season of ministry and journeying, as we've said before, into an unknown new. We don't know what the new is like, but we know God's there. We don't know what the challenges will be, but we know God will be amongst us and leading us and shaping it as we just depend on him and focus on being a people who are connected with him and filled with his presence and his power. So transition involves working with the Holy Spirit to process history, receive reaffirmation of mission, receive fresh hope about the future where there's release and healing from disappointment, to receive new vision and new empowerment. It comes out of this season of reflection, this season where Jesus can step in and stand on the shore of the lake, interact with people on a personal level, allow the good, the bad, and the ugly of the past to be processed, being there, speaking in his gentle voice, saying, "Hey, children," coming with a message of reinvigoration and healing and restoration and refocusing and fresh hope. This is the power of the time of reflection. This is the power of the time of stepping back between seasons of ministry, of allowing God to come and God to speak and God to direct and to redirect. This is a time to be engaged in the practicalities of what is going on, of letting the Holy Spirit into history, allowing him to come and to speak, letting Jesus reaffirm the call, letting him sift out, what belongs in the past and what will be carried on in the future, of letting him stir new passion so that we can respond in recommitment like Peter did, celebrating all of the victories and all of the good stuff that God has done personally and collectively, and carrying that legacy forward so it can be an impetus for bearing new fruit in a new season, of experiencing healing and from pain and grief and discouragement and disappointment, as Peter needed. Even though he was on the road, he stumbled. Even though he was on the road, things didn't go the greatest. Even though he was on the road, he probably felt self-recrimination and doubt come into his heart. Some of that joy and excitement, there's a lid on it for a season until he got free again. But there on the shore of the lake, he could break out of that disappointment, and within weeks he would be leading the charge, so to speak, on the day of Pentecost, preaching that magnificent message in Jerusalem, explaining the outpouring of the Spirit, the ascension of Jesus to the right hand of the Father, and really serving as a key person in the establishment of the early church. So this is a time to discover grace and empowerment for a new season, to receive personal and collective hope and vision, and to find reconciliation and re-engagement in relationships that might have gone through some upheaval, and to receive fresh passion. So just want to encourage everyone to stay connected, stay involved. We'll be going into our our groups for communion in a few minutes. But in this process of transition and working with the transition team are going to be active amongst the congregation in the next few weeks. So as they reach out, just connect in, be part of it, and it's the next step in the process as we prepare for fresh vision, fresh direction, new leadership, new direction for the season that's coming. So God bless you guys. Have a great day. Enjoy the sun. Probably be not too many more weeks of it, and we'll catch up soon. So we'll see you in groups in just a few minutes. Okay. God bless.